All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. You can also follow my guest for the hour today, Matt Yglesias, on Twitter at Matt Yglesias. He is the author of the new book, 1 Billion Americans. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
I'm really glad to be here.
Before I get started, I just have to say, I think it's kind of odd. This is the first conversation we're ever having. You're one of the OG, like, blogger generation, thought leader, argument haver, thinkers, and it seems like, I mean, I think I've done, I don't know how many, but at least 24 things with Ezra over the years, and yet I've still never met you.
Well, there you go. It's been, one of the nice things about the kind of virtual podcast book tour has been to connect with some other longtime internet personalities, who I don't know in person. But
yeah, I want to circle back to some of that, but I do want to talk obviously about your book. Before I do, though, I think it's incumbent on me to address something, which is that there's a number of people who have in recent months proposed that you are going to be forced to exit your role at Vox and end up at someplace on the center right. And they frequently throw us out as an institution among that number, along with Manhattan and a couple of others. And I think that that's a testament to the fact that you have always been a contrarian thinker, not in sort of an impulsive way, because you do come up with arguments. But do you think this is kind of a testament to the fact that you're willing to engage and interact with a lot of things that don't typically work as the main narrative focus of the institutions that you've been part of?
Well, I'm not sure if I would put it that way exactly, but, I do like to stir up trouble. Some people, there's some issues, right? So there's a Supreme Court vacancy now. I don't want to get too into it because it's a little pointless. But it's like, I have just like totally normal liberal opinions about this. You could guess, you could read anybody else's takes. I'm like, I just totally agree with them. And I find there's something wrong with that. Like, you have to have conventional opinions about something, but I find it a little tedious to do that kind of work. To write the same column as every other liberal who's like, these conservative judges, I don't agree with their judging. And I don't agree with how Merrick Garland, I don't, and like, I can do it. Like, it's my job to cover what's in the news. But like, I am more interested in topics that, are more difficult or a little more unconventional, or where you have different kinds of arguments with people. And, it's like one of my motives writing this book, which is not contrarian exactly, but it's just like a little weird, right? Like, this book is not the same political argument that we are having in every op-ed page in America, that left and right are having every day on Twitter. And, that's what I like.
There's a central thesis, obviously, to your book that I think people can probably assume from your title or are familiar with by now, which is an argument for American exceptionalism in a way, or the continuance of it, that this is something that ought to be continued, and that we're not talking about it or thinking about it when it comes to our population in the way that we do, that this is an important issue that we ought to put more at the center of our political discussion and policy discussion, and that it has not been that. Tell me a little bit, in terms of your own focus on this issue, what were the motivating factors? What made you really start to think about this as a problem, and one that needed to be addressed in this forum?
So, one way to think about it is, you may remember that Donald Trump was elected president a few years ago. There's been some discussion of him and his campaign in the years. Yeah. And so, one thing that some people on the left have said about Trump all this time, he'll do something that the liberals are upset about. And they'll say, this is not who we are as a country. This is not America. And then there's another school of thought of people who are like, no, like, this totally is America. America is like a racist country and violent, and all kinds of awful things happen. And Trump is just like another damn thing. I side much more with this is not who we are kind of school of thought. Which is just to say that, like, because, you know, this is the Federalist audience, but when I see a prominent politician doing something that I think is really bad, that really violates my sense of what's right, my instinct, you know, is to say, this violates what I think America is about. And that's not everybody's instinct on the left, but it is mine, you know? And so I started thinking about that, like, why do I feel that way, right? And what do I think about it? And to me, so much of it was that Trump's kind of nativist approach, to me, really undermines a lot of what I would characterize as the well springs of American greatness. And I was trying to think, you know, more seriously, okay, we can have emotional reactions to things, but like, what do I mean by that? Like, how do I spell that out? And I started thinking about, like, well, why is the United States a great power at all, right? There's like Canada, right, has the same, you know, Anglo-Saxon cultural heritage, the rule of law, representative government, high standard of living. It's a nice place. You know, I've been to Toronto, been to Winnipeg even. It's good, right? But Canada doesn't matter, right, in the scheme of things. They're like nice, they have a peacekeeping memorial somewhere, but like, why doesn't Canada matter? It's not really because we are unique as Americans in like having good values. I mean, we do, I think, but they have nice values up there too. But like, this is a big ass country, you know, and we made it that way over time. We encouraged people to come here and, you know, grow our cities and Homestead Act and settle the land. And, you know, of course, you can focus on the fact that like some horrible crimes were committed in the course of settling that land. But one way or another, like, it was done, right? And a lot of people came over here and we had babies, and people didn't emigrate from the United States. Doug Saunders has a book about Canada, and he shows tons of Canadians moved to the US over the course of the 19th century.
Primarily, they're comedians.
Yeah. No, but I mean, honestly, a lot of people, just because it's, you know, like, it's cold, right? Like, if you had to be a farmer in America or a farmer in Saskatchewan, like, you take America. It's just better. And so, like, that's good, right? And so, you know, started trying to build a book out of that, right? And you look at China, and China's a really big deal. People talk about China a lot. We're banning their video meme apps, or maybe not banning it. And so, like, why is China important? Right? They don't have a dynamic, interesting ideology. They're not people around the world who are like, oh yeah, I want to sign up for this. But it's big, you know. So they have the income of maybe Mexico or Bulgaria, but at 4 times our population, Mexico or Bulgaria level GDP is enough to be a really big deal on the world stage. And I think that we should think seriously about rising to that challenge the way the sort of leaders of the early republic, you know, like, made America not just a nice, pleasant place where we had plenty of land and, you know, didn't have to pay taxes on our tea, but like also a great power, and that we should try to live up to that destiny.
This is just connecting back to your point about the Supreme Court nomination. One of the things that I've already seen being memed by people online, and that I've certainly seen before, is variants of attacks on people with large families. It's something that is a recurring element of experience on the right, and you know, even our friend Abby Huntsman, when she had twins recently, was attacked for it, and basically, you know, people online saying this is just a sign you don't care about the environment, you don't care about the planet, etc. It seems to me a core element of what you're trying to do with this book is to push back against the idea that America cannot encompass or tolerate a billion Americans, that instead it's something that we can rise to and meet as a policy challenge, and that while there are some drawbacks, as you frame them, that those drawbacks are worth the benefits. How much pushback have you gotten so far for your argument from the left on this point?
You know, this is an interesting thing. I mean, if you are on the left at all, and you write about things, you'll have had the experience, people joke about this. Sooner or later, you hear from the population control people. And it happened to me, I think, back in 2004. This was primitive times on the internet. And so it was like a postcard, and it's always the same, right? You're writing about some problem, usually something ecological in nature. And somebody says, well, isn't the real problem that there's too many people? And what's interesting is that was very mainstream. I mean, as you probably know better than I do, 60s, 70s environmentalism had really close ties to sort of anti-natalist population control movement, and also to anti-immigration movements for similar reasons. That has not been the case on an official level for quite a while now. The mainstream leaders of environmental groups are not anti-natalists, they're not population controllers, they're not anti-immigration, but the sentiment continues to be widespread. And something you see with social media is like what used to be like a weird postcard I would get to the office at the American Prospect. Those are like tweets now, right? And, I think people on the right should understand the dynamic there, right? And like, it is both true that there are a lot of people who think that and say it and may hassle people. There was one tweet recently. It was like a woman posed with, I think, 7 or 8 children. It was a large family.
Yeah.
And somebody said like, this is environmental terrorism.
Yeah.
And I pushed back on that. But also, the person saying that was not like the head of the Sierra Club.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's always a difference. I mean, you have this in all political movements between like, what's the official doctrine and like, what do some people say? And it's definitely there. Although it was interesting when I came out with the book, right? Because mainstream environmental groups are not anti-natalist and they're not anti-immigration. My book is pro-natalist and pro-immigration. A number of the reviews written by liberals, you see this Felix Salmon's review in the New York Times, are very skeptical of the book on climate grounds. And it's interesting because Felix, as far as I know, I actually do know, like, he's not an immigration restrictionist, and he doesn't think we should impose strict population control measures. So I don't think he disagrees with me. And yet he thinks he disagrees with me, right? It's a point of dissonance, I think, on the left about how they want to think about this. And it stems from, frankly, overstating how bad the problem of climate change is.
I think that this kind of dovetails with Michael Schellenberger's latest book, Apocalypse Never, where he basically, makes the argument that yes, these problems are real, but we can work our way through them and out of them with technology and the advancement of a bunch of different, courses of action that he says. And I think he falls in the same category as you on this subject. But I will just say, I do think that this stuff creeps out in odd spaces. I do hear overpopulation concerns voiced at places like Aspen, and in conversations, particularly with sort of the more European liberals that I know, and whenever it does, it gets into a really uncomfortable space very quickly, at least for me, and basically of the mindset that the real problem here is that the developing world isn't developing fast enough, and when they do develop and the women there start going to college, they'll have fewer kids, and until then we need to take various measures to make sure that they don't create future environmental problems for us. To me, that's just such a pessimistic, anti-future kind of perspective to have on our ability to solve these problems. To a certain degree, are you just making an argument from a perspective of optimism about what we can achieve technologically, the development of new solutions to these problems, as opposed to a pessimistic, we're never going to be able to invent anything to deal with these things, people will behave the way they always have, and that will doom the planet perspective?
Well, I think Schellenberger's book is interesting on the sort of technical details of climate change and the role of technology and some other things like that. I would say, on the level of values, right, there is a difference between a sort of technocratic, externalities-based view of pollution, right, which is to say, like, people like to have cars, and gasoline helps cars move, which is sort of the point.
Mhm.
The way it works is you burn the gasoline. What happens when you burn things is like there's fumes, and everybody knows this on some level, right? Like if I put a fire in the middle of your house, like you'd be mad, right? Now, of course, you wouldn't want me to burn the house down, but even if I avoided that, right? Even if the fire was perfectly safe, but just your whole house was filling with smoke, like you'd be pissed off at me, right?
Yeah.
And so this is like the externalities view, right? We need to strike a balance between the usefulness of burning gasoline and the harm of like putting soot out everywhere. And technologies, we have catalytic converters, and now we have electric cars. So it's a dance, right? There's a cost benefit, and as technology changes, what's cost effective to do also changes.
Mhm.
A different thing is that there is a pastoralist or neo-pastoralist worldview that modern civilization is in some sense bad, and that what everybody should do is live on a farm in Vermont and do a lot of composting. And, from that point of view, heating your house in the winter with a wood-burning stove based on trees that you tenderly cut down in your own backyard, that might be fine. Right. But like when you look at it, like actually a wood burning stove is much more polluting than a natural gas boiler. But one is more like in touch with nature, quote unquote. Right. And both of those strains of thought exist under the umbrella of environmentalism. Like we need to pay attention to the science of pollution externalities, and we need to reject modernity and like live in huts, right? Like those ideas are both there, but they're not the same idea, right? And so like, should we invest money in trying to perfect nuclear microreactor designs? From an externality standpoint, like, yes, obviously, right? From a kind of purity preserved nature standpoint, like, maybe no, right? Should we just like do what we can to get more people in electric cars? Like I say yes, like they're cleaner, they're cool. Like I drove a Tesla one time. It was really fun. I wish I could afford one. Maybe if everybody buys the book, I will. But that's different from like, there's a neo-pastoralist and like eco-pessimist sentiments out there that I just don't agree with. There are also scientific facts about carbon dioxide and planetary temperatures and ocean rise and like actual problems. But if you're thinking in terms of problems, then you think in terms of solutions. If you're thinking in terms of defilement of nature, then you're just going to say like, don't do it.
What do you view as the chief policy barriers today preventing Americans from having more children?
In policy terms, I want to be clear about this because like I don't actually think policy is the most important determinant here. But I think the main thing, if you look at the United States, is that the market economy does not magically shower us with income at the time in your life when it's like most optimal to start having families, right? We have reached a point where you need more years either in school or in practical experience on the job to really reach sort of prime breadwinnering capacity. But like to have children, it's good to be in your 20s or maybe your early 30s. And particularly if you want to have multiple children over the course of a lifetime, it has to start, on the earlier side of things. And so we need to do things that provide financial resources to people who are in that moment in life. And, so in the book, I talk about just cash grants, right? Like straight money to parents of young kids. I talk about preschool. I talk about there's a lot of intricacies around like daycare policy because there's some efficiencies to sort of center-based daycare and reasons to subsidize that. But you also get into a lot of like mommy wars type stuff. I think conventionally Democrats will say they'll come up with a policy that's been crafted by very successful, professionally ambitious liberal women, and they will craft a policy that meets their concerns with the difficult economics of child rearing, but there are lots of more traditionalist people who might want to spend time at home with their kids, but actually struggle to have the financial means to do that. And so you want to try to create a policy that works for all types of families. But the basic issue is that particularly kids under 5, the out-of-pocket costs are astronomical. And for sort of Baumel's law reasons, not despite the fact that we're richer, but because we're richer, it's more expensive than it used to be. And, we just sort of need to decide, right? Like, do we want to be libertarians about this who think, well, a baby is just kind of like a really expensive kind of pet, right? It's like wanting to have a giraffe at home or some kind of really exotic lizard. And so the government should be neutral. Or do we want to say, and this is where, I find more in common with, cultural conservatives and religious conservatives, and thinking that like the economy is important and it's good to have markets, but like also we have values in our life and things that we think are important. And like, I think that children and families are important, and policy should recognize that, because the labor market just doesn't, right? It penalizes you for having kids because, well, you'll see when your baby's born, but it's hard to get a good night's sleep. There's like a lot of problems there, right? But we don't want to live in a society where just nobody has kids.
In cities across the country, children are a luxury good. The more kids that you see someone walking around with in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, you have to look at them and say, they must have an absurd amount of money to be able to afford to live here and do this, with the normal expectations of, say, an upper middle class livelihood, or the experiences that their children will have, and the expectations for them in terms of schooling and goods and toys and all the rest. How can we change that? How can we make children not a luxury good in our major cities? And in particular, what do we do to address the housing challenge for young parents that seems to always crop up and prompt them to find cities just completely impossible to live in and function in as young families?
Right. So, people say sort of two things about families in cities. And one is they say, well, I want more space, or I don't think city's right for me. And, that's fine. I grew up in Manhattan, and frankly, I think that was great. But the other thing is just cost, right? The per square foot price of housing in New York City, in San Francisco, in Washington, D.C., in Los Angeles, in Seattle, in Boston is really, really high. And if you're 24, you can take like a 4-bedroom house, and it can all be full of 20-somethings who each have their own jobs. And, it's a group house, and you have fun parties, and there you go. It's hard if you're trying to support a family, right? Get a family-sized dwelling there. The answer is to make it legal to build more houses in the places where the costs are high, right? And that means, row houses probably in most places, but in the biggest cities, it means like big apartment buildings, sometimes medium-sized apartment buildings. But there's nothing, we have magically solved the technological problem of how to fit a lot of people onto scarce land. And then we've, in a regulatory sense, created a new problem, right, of basically not allowing that in a lot of our central cities and a lot of our suburbs, and even the places that people think of as less regulated in this regard are still pretty incredibly regulated. Like, there was something I talk about in the book is a reform they did in Houston. People will sometimes say, oh, in Houston, they have no zoning. And I guess they don't. But for the longest time, they had minimum lot size rules everywhere, which was about the same as zoning. And then in the inner highway ring, they rescinded that. And lo and behold, people started building attached houses. They started building townhouse clusters. And the problem there, well, I don't want to say the problem, but what you see in Houston is that they did not recreate the exact way that old-fashioned walkable urban neighborhoods look, right? And this is sort of the dissonance that we tend to get, is that on the one hand, you have people who just like regulating things for the sake of it. On the other hand, you have people who just like believe in the normative value of single family zoning. It was like that St. Louis couple who I think was originally supposed to come to the RNC to talk about gun rights, wound up saying something about the importance of single family zoning, which I think not even in place where it was confusing, but it was something they said. And then you have kind of nostalgics, right, who will walk around, a place like Old Town, where you live, and let's say, oh, this is really cool. If we could make a neighborhood that's exactly like that, I would accept it. But like Old Town, it's old. It's there in the name. It's an old town. If you want people to live in the modern day, it's like you have to let them use modern construction techniques, build modern buildings. So they've got it in Houston. They're starting to do it in LA to an extent with the new accessory dwelling unit law they have there. It strikes a lot of people as ugly. And a really fascinating thing is that if you look historically, whatever new kind of buildings are being built are always described as ugly by the people at that time. So I live in a sort of historic row house neighborhood in Washington called Logan Circle that I think most people think looks nice now. You're not allowed to change the buildings because it's historic. The old newspaper clippings are like, oh my God, these greedy developers, they don't care about architecture. They're just throwing up these cookie cutter houses. And I don't know why that is, but people hate new buildings, but they're great for the practical purpose of putting a roof over the head of a family.
Tell me a little bit about the land management side of this. Where do we need to engage, either on the federal level or otherwise, in order to allow more expansion, more people to go into places that historically in America have, even despite the fact that they're beautiful and that they're wonderful places to visit and vacation, people have not occupied to a great degree. And particularly in this context that, there's so many people who I know who are in the middle to upper middle class kind of position, who in the wake of this pandemic and lockdown are finally pulling the plug basically and moving, having discovered that they can work from home and that it's something that they're okay with, are saying, you know what, I'm finally going to move to Texas. I'm going to move to Colorado. We actually had an employee who did that, and it's one of these things where I understand their motivation, but I also think that there's a lot of risk entailed in that if you don't feel like there's going to be places that you can move to that have the necessary things that you need in a new community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. America is really big. It's a point I try to make in the book. We have, if we had 1 billion Americans, which is a lot, I mean, I don't want to deny it, we would have like about the population density of France, about half the density of Germany. So there's plenty of space for people to live in the sort of generic sense, right? But then the question becomes is like, well, can people get into the desirable spots? Because what we had, I think, over the past 10 years is we've seen an interesting kind of game of hopscotch, where for a while, a lot of people were leaving expensive coastal cities and we're going to Denver and we're going to Austin. I mean, people go to lots of places, but Denver and Austin in particular appeal to people who have the same sensibility as people who might like to live on the coasts. And so Denver and Austin just started to get expensive because they have similar, particularly in Colorado, just very similar land use issues where you can't convert single family neighborhoods into attached dwellings and mid-rises. And you also have limits to sort of where the sprawl can go. And, when that's what happens, like you get these really high prices, or you get the Austin case where the sprawl outside of Travis County is not really limited, but people don't necessarily want to live in a totally generic Texas suburb. I mean, many people do, but like a lot of people, like they want to live in Austin, right? And like, why not? It's cool. It's a fun city. And it's become really expensive. And that's because people see like one neighborhood where there's cranes and towers going up and they're like, it's a construction boom. But you just drive around and there's like stretch after stretch of single family home, often not that big even, just sort of normal, modest single-family houses, but they become very pricey. And the natural economic thing to do would be to replace some of them with bigger buildings and, accommodate more people. And we just are not doing that in America. And, it creates a lot of big problems.
The opening chapter of your book, the introduction, seems to have a number of elements to it that, as I was reading, I thought, am I sure that he wrote this introduction, or is this something that's been written for him by Josh Hawley? Because it basically sounds the same elements: concern about China's rise, a belief in the essential nature of America's role in the world, a rejection of kind of Malthusian assumptions about the economy and the environment, and an emphatic push for more Americans, but particularly more natalist policies that will help support Americans in that vein, and not just offer tax cuts for the rich.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all things that kind of the new socially conservative right tends to be in favor of. Do they have significant support on the left?
I mean, I wonder, do they have significant support from Josh Hawley? I mean, it's interesting. I find him to be a slightly puzzling figure. I often enjoy his takes. I mean, I think he has a lot of interesting ideas. He did a great interview about a year ago with my colleagues at The Verge, talking about antitrust and technology. And, I not just in terms of those kind of big themes, but I think something that's he says that I really agree with is that we can't just have an economy that's on autopilot. We need to think about the communities, in the heartland, like not just in a symbolic way, because I would never think about heartland communities as a symbolic way. I grew up in New York. I lived on the East Coast my whole life, but like in a tangible, material way. It's like, what are we going to do to make like St. Louis and Kansas City and small towns and like thrive, right? Because it's clear that just sort of not caring and like assuming it'll all work out has not actually worked, right? So that's great. Then I was like, well, where is Josh Hawley's like legislation? What's he actually doing on this? I find the opposite with Democrats in Congress, right? So 37 or 8, I think, senators have signed on to this American Family Act, which is a proposal to give cash grants to parents of young kids. And you ask them about it, you're like, what's up with this? They're like, it's going to cut child poverty by a third, which it will, which is amazing. Lyman Stone's a religious conservative guy, Institute for Family Studies. He indicated, based on his research, that it would create about 0.25 extra children per family over the long term, which is a huge impact, actually, on fertility. I mean, if you think about how that compounds across multiple generations, it's like a really big deal. And yet none of the people who are involved in the legislation will like touch that with a 10-foot pole. You know what I mean? It's like, this is sort of like what we were talking about.
Why is that? What is the reason?
Pessimists.
What is the reason that they won't talk about that?
I mean, I think because they don't want to get into a fight with the population control people, that it's like, it's acceptable, even desirable on the left to want to do things that will have the effect of making it easier for people to have more kids, but to say that that's what you want to do, right? It rubs some eco-pessimists the wrong way. It rubs some secular-minded people the wrong way. I mean, also like there's a joke about this even in the text of the book, but it's like, I don't know how this goes in conservative families, but like a lot of young professional women who I know spend a lot of time getting hassled by their parents about like, when are they going to start having some babies? And they really don't like that. Right. And so like any talk of this, it's not that they're opposed, you know what I mean? But like, they don't want to hear about it. They think it's creepy. But I don't think that that's good, right? Like, I think that we need to have, I don't want to sound too much of a like dippy person about this, but like we need to have some kind of bipartisan legislation on some subjects, right? We need at a certain point, Josh Hawley to give a speech about something, and then Sherrod Brown to say, Josh, you said this thing in this
Mm-hmm.
speech. As it happens, I was working on this legislation with Michael Bennett. This conservative guy says that our bill will do blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really what we talked about when we wrote the bill, but it's what you're talking about. Like, maybe we could do an event together. And like, I mean, I can't even get into why Congress is such a shit show,
Well,
but it's like, if you have a world in which nobody tries to get things done, there is no incentive to talk in terms of the values that the other people care about.
mm-hmm. While I share, I think with you in terms of your policy perspective on immigration, a very positive attitude, I do feel like that's an area that's going to be very difficult to find people. At the same time, I feel like this is one area where that should be possible in terms of a pro-natalist agenda, essentially designed to give people the resources that they need to navigate an economy that, to your point, is not providing them with those resources at the point in time where it will lead to them having more children. They end up with having more of those resources later in life, and engaging in later first pregnancies, later engagement with the kind of family life, and that drives down those numbers, and we don't want to see that. I just don't get why that's a partisan issue. Outside of the eco concerns, which I think can be very strongly argued against, I just feel like that's something that in a world in which everything is a partisan issue, I don't understand why wanting more kids and making sure that people who have kids have the resources to support them is as I guess something that people don't want to touch.
I mean, it's like everything is a partisan issue because everything is a partisan issue, right? I mean, I often feel like members of Congress and even like dueling like social media cliques, right? They look for reasons to disagree, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you, I read some business books a bunch at one point in my life, and one of the great ones is called Getting to Yes, right?
Yes.
And it's about like how successful negotiations work. And after I read that book, it was just so clear to me that so much of what happens in Congress, it's not that they're like failing to reach agreements. They're not trying, right? And so like one of the big things, the bullet points in that book is that you talk principles, not positions, right? Which is to say, you enter a negotiation by saying, what am I trying to do here, right? So it's like, I want to sell books. What do you want to do here? You want to have an entertaining episode of your show that people will enjoy, right? And so then like when we start there, we can whittle down and like work something out. And it's not hard. Like people do this all the time. People from the left and people from the right. Like when we have something we want to accomplish, we can easily work together. Everything that happens in Congress is like the opposite of that, right? So it'll be like, we need billions of dollars for state and local governments versus we've got to have no bailout for these failing blue states. Mm-hmm. So now we're talking positions, right? And you can't bargain. Everybody's got their fixed positions. And
bailouts versus needed infrastructure.
Yeah, and you're just like you're not going anywhere, right? So you can always do it because there will always be things to disagree about, right? I mean, we have two coalitions. They're anchored in different sort of visions of the good life, different demographics, different things like that. So it's easy to disagree, right? And it's hard to agree, unless you want to. And so I actually you talked about Senator Hawley. Something I talk about in the book is trying to relocate government agencies, the sort of less political ones, maybe into Midwestern cities. And so there was a move to take U.S. Department of Agriculture personnel and move them into the Kansas City area. And it really hasn't gone well. And one of the big reasons it hasn't gone well is that it's just like it's logistically hard to move people's jobs, right? Donald Trump is a very polarizing figure. When he says to like Democrats who don't necessarily want their jobs to move, we're doing it, there's naturally a lot of suspicion from them, right? And then Hawley sort of made political hay by taking the most overstated suspicions that were raised and like dunking on coastal snob elites, right? Which is like, that's great politics for him, right? Like,
Mhm.
you know, you represent Missouri, finding something mean that a Washington bureaucrat said about Missouri and being like, F you, like, that's great. That's a no-brainer, right? On the other hand, he's not a dumb man.
Yeah.
He must understand that if you tell hundreds of people, sorry, your job's moving to Kansas City, that like they don't have to be like bigots or snobs or whatever to be upset about that. And if you want it to happen, right? If you want this to be a successful initiative, you've got to ignore the most unreasonable complaints people make.
I
You've
do
got to
personally wonder how that proposal, that whole like move things out of the, by the way, that's an old Rick Perry idea.
Yeah.
Still, yeah. Is how that would have played out if it was done like this summer.
Right, sure.
Like,
I mean, right, exactly. People might have liked it more at this point in time. But it's just like, you know, it's a tough one. And I was going to say I don't blame him for playing the politics. I kind of do blame him for playing the politics just because it's such a safe seat.
Mhm.
And it's like one of the things that used to happen to some extent in politics is that people would get, you know, comfortable in their position there and start saying, you know what, I can be a little bit more high-minded. I don't need to fight like a rabid dog for this lopsided Senate seat. But you know, it's just like it's tough out there.
So let me shift a little bit to a couple of things before we wrap things up. I know that you spent. When was your first? Did you start blogging before 9/11 or was it after?
No, it was after. It was summer 2002.
Yeah. So you've spent more than 18 years online.
Absolutely.
Very online. What is an argument that you have had in the past that you would very much like to revisit?
Revisit meaning like change my position because I was wrong?
Maybe change your position, or maybe just that your position would be more refined, that like you feel like you could make a better argument now. I mean, you've gotten to so many arguments over the years on so many different, like a broad range of policy, you know, sort of debates. Like what's one that you'd like to revisit?
I wish that I could go back to actually the climate change debate of sort of around 2008, 2009, when that was happening, because I both stand by the view that like the federal government should have taken more serious action about climate change than we actually did, that sort of basic high level impulse was correct. But part of researching this book is I did sort of come to change my view somewhat of what the climate problem is exactly and what the right kind of solutions are. And I think I could have, you know, I think I both could have made different, better arguments about what we needed to do and had more skepticism about some of the specific elements of, you know, the Waxman-Markey bill and some of the other things that were happening there. I become much more of the view that we need to think about doing more rather than doing less, if you know what I mean. That you can't just sort of get people. You can't have just a sticks-oriented policy where you're going to tell people, okay, we're going to cap emissions and we're going to make you pay up if you don't do it. We need to think about how can we develop the kind of breakthroughs that push us forward.
I wonder if you have a particular issue as it relates to foreign policy that you'd like to revisit, particularly, you know, I think that there were a lot of people from our generation of writers who were opposed to the Iraq War, found its prosecution as it went further along to be increasingly incompetent and bad, and then kind of assumed that because then Senator Obama and, you know, becoming President Obama was a critic, that he would improve things. I've increasingly soured on his foreign policy to a greater degree than I was when he was president, particularly in his second term. What are your thoughts on kind of the direction his foreign policy took, especially given the context of both Trump's rise as a critic of those wars and his continued inability to actually extract us from them?
I don't know. I mean, I remember one moment at some point in Obama's term, and he gave a speech, or maybe it was an offhand remark, and he said, like, we ended 2 wars. With something he was saying, I think around 2015, 2014. And it was a few weeks after that, my friend got her orders to deploy for her third term. Her third tour to Afghanistan for the war that President Obama said had already ended.
Yes.
And I was like, I don't know. And then
my brother was in the same boat. Yes.
And then three or 4 years later, I hear President Trump saying he brought the troops home from Afghanistan. And they're still there. It's incredibly frustrating. And I am both more frustrated with the decisions that brought us to this place, but also, I mean, I genuinely don't understand. There's clearly something at work in how the uniformed military, the top brass there, relates to the civilian leadership that makes it challenging for 2 presidents in a row
of different parties
who are not just, but like really different, right?
Yes.
Very different temperaments, very different approaches, very different theories of how do you make change, but who seem to have a similar goal in this regard. Mm-hmm. And they have both not really done what they say they are trying to do. And it really makes you wonder, like what is going, and I think we know broadly, I mean, not to be like too mysterious about it, but it's like the military bureaucracy has some way of rolling the presidents. But like, I still don't really know. There's like a million memoirs written by veterans of both of these administrations.
Yes.
And I have not going to claim that I read them all, but I do see the coverage, and I still haven't like quite gotten the like, and here's the thing that they do that stops the president from just saying like, we're getting out.
Well, I've got an interview tomorrow with H.R. McMaster about his new book, and I plan to ask him that. But it's one of these things where, you had, to your point, 2 different presidents, 2 different parties, very different men, both running as critics of America's pre-existing foreign policy, who once they got into office, basically found it almost impossible to shove us away from, and particularly our involvement in Afghanistan, which I just think people are just completely over in terms of a place that they want to throw any more American resources. It's pretty stunning. One more thing before I let you go. The arguments that you've advanced in this book are obviously ones that I think we have to wrestle with and deal with as Americans about our attitude toward the future. We're talking at a moment in which trust in American institutions is at historic lows. The way that people feel in terms of their pessimism coming out of a year which has included so many bad trends and global pandemic and economic challenge and everything else, they're probably not in the mood to feel happy about the future. And so for so many people who I know who are bringing kids into the world this year, I've heard their sort of contentions with, I can't believe I'm bringing a kid into, a world that looks like this, that kind of thing. What kind of note of, since we're both, I think, hopeful about the future, be set free of optimism and learn hope instead. What is the hope that you give to people that says things are going to get better? And one of the things that's going to help make things better going forward is if we have more Americans in order to invent things, drive things, make for a more vibrant economy, make for things looking up and not down, better, not worse. How do you make that argument in this context?
I think we've been in a kind of flywheel of pessimism and defeatism ever since sometime in 2004 or 5, when it became clear that the adventure in Iraq was not going to have the benefits, the lighting the fire of freedom that spreads throughout the universe, or whatever was in Bush's second inaugural. And it's made us more inward looking. We've had diminished expectations. And that has made us more zero sum in our interactions with each other, right? More of an assumption that we are fighting over a limited pie. And that has in turn limited what we can accomplish, because this is a really big, really diverse country. And things can only happen if we are able to transcend like the basic ways in which our lifestyles and values and attitudes differ. And with Trump, it's become this like vortex, right? Where like the just like existence of the president is this culture war flashpoint, right? And people fight and fight and fight and don't even like try to get 60% of the vote, it's like you see politicians like not aiming for the home runs. They're trying to grind it out, right? And that's depressing. It's a depressing cycle of lowered expectations, lowered aspirations. And I think if we think about challenges that are external to us, right, we see that there is a lot that we disagree about. But like there was a story today that I just read that they are going to take the Xinjiang concentration camp model and start exporting it to Tibet. And I don't think there's anybody in America who reads that story and is like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Go do that, right? Like, you could be the most traditionalist, Christian conservative, the most secular liberal. Everyone's like, man, that's bad, right? And so like, what can we do together to keep a world that's safe for our values, that's not this kind of wild adventures that didn't work out 10, 20, 15 years ago, but that draws on like our real capabilities as a country. We have a unique ability to accept and assimilate immigrants if we like choose to believe in ourselves and create legal pathways to do that. We know how to build houses. We need to legalize it. Like people have been having babies for thousands and thousands of years. They just need a little money. Like we can do these things, but we need to focus on the problems that are really, really important and not just yell at each other.
Matt Yglesias' new book is 1 Billion Americans. Congratulations on it and good luck with it. The world must be peopled, as Shakespeare wrote. So
thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.